Look into this image entitled The Holographic Cosmogram, then explain the ethical system derived from your comprehension. Then perfectly detail the behavior of Western Europe and its cultural descendants towards Africa and people of African descent from 1492 up until the present day in light of this ethical comprehension across all areas of human activity. The Holographic Cosmogram, an ethical framework, and its implications for Western African relations. The image titled The Holographic Cosmogram presents a complex philosophical and ethical system rooted in African ontology, combining elements of Ubuntu philosophy and traditional African cosmological understanding. This intricate diagram offers profound insights into an integrated ethical framework that, when properly comprehended, provides a powerful lens through which to evaluate historical and contemporary relations between Western societies and African peoples. Understanding the Holographic Cosmogram. The Holographic Cosmogram integrates several key philosophical components, most prominently the concept of Ubuntu at its crown. Ubuntu, meaning humanity in various Bantu languages, represents a fundamental African ethical principle that emphasizes the interconnectedness of all human beings. Often expressed as I am because we are, this philosophy recognizes that a person's humanity is inextricably tied to their relationships with others and the broader community. The cosmogram's hexagonal structure with interconnected points mirrors elements found in the traditional Congo cosmogram Dikenga, a core symbol in Bakongo religion that represents the cyclical nature of existence. The Congo cosmogram depicts the physical world Kuinseke, the spiritual world Kumimpemba, and the Kalunga line that connects them, embodying the 4 moments of the sun and the 4 stages of life. This symbolism reflects a holistic worldview, where the material and spiritual realms exist in continuous dialogue. The cosmogram organizes reality into 6 fundamental dimensions: who, the entities and beings that populate existence; what, the nature and substance of reality; why, the purposes and motivations that drive existence; how, the methods through which reality is experienced and interpreted; when, where, the temporal and spatial dimensions of existence; all the mathematical and structural principles that underpin reality. At its core, the cosmogram contains numerical sequences 1, 2, 4, 2, 1, 2, 1, suggesting mathematical relationships that govern cosmic order. The mathematical representations at the bottom of the image further emphasize that reality operates according to consistent, recognizable patterns. The derived ethical system. From this cosmogram emerges an ethical framework with several foundational principles. 1. Radical interconnectedness. The core Ubuntu concept I am, because we are, establishes that human identity is fundamentally relational. Unlike Western individualism, this perspective sees the self as constituted through community relationships. 2. Holistic integration. The cosmogram illustrates that ethical behavior must consider all dimensions of existence simultaneously, the spiritual alongside the material, the collective alongside the individual. 3. Cyclical justice. Drawing from the Congo cosmogram elements, this ethical system recognizes that actions have consequences that move through cyclical patterns of existence, suggesting that ethical debts must eventually be reconciled. 4. Communal self-realization. True human excellence, Ubuntu, is achieved not through individualistic pursuits, but through developing one's humanity in relation to others. To have Ubuntu is to live a genuinely human life, rather than a merely animal existence. 5. Symmetry and balance. The mathematical element suggests that ethical relationships should maintain proper proportions and balances, with reciprocity as a guiding principle. Western European behavior toward Africa since 1492, when examined through the ethical framework of the holographic cosmogram, Western Europe's historical and ongoing relationship with Africa and people of African descent reveals profound contradictions with these ethical principles. The transatlantic slave trade, Fundamental ethical rupture. The transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported approximately 12 million Africans to the Americas and Europe from the 15th century onward, represents perhaps the most severe violation of the Cosmogram's ethical principles. This system deliberately severed the interconnections that define humanity according to Ubuntu philosophy. Portugal initiated this rupture, beginning not with legitimate trade but with slave raiding on the western African coast. This violence was spuriously justified through theological constructs like the curse of Cain, creating a pseudo-religious rationalization for dehumanization. This directly contradicted the WHHI mention of the Cosmogram, which recognizes the sacred nature of all human beings. The very term slave trade obscures the reality that people were not commodities to be traded but human beings violently stolen from their communities. This linguistic framing reflects the fundamental ethical misalignment between Ubuntu's recognition of shared humanity and the European colonial worldview that categorized certain humans as property. Scientific racism, corrupting knowledge systems. Western scientific frameworks developed elaborate taxonomies of human difference that directly contradicted the Cosmogram's principle of shared humanity. These systems of scientific racism were not mere theoretical constructs but powerful tools for justifying exploitation and oppression. In South Africa, scientific racism provided intellectual scaffolding for systems of segregation and apartheid, creating arbitrary divisions where the Cosmogram recognizes fundamental connection. This scientific apparatus violated the all-dimension of the Cosmogram, which emphasizes equality, symmetry, and wholeness as cosmic principles. Medical racism, from experimentation on enslaved people to contemporary health disparities, demonstrates a continued failure to recognize the full humanity of African-descended peoples. This violates the Y dimension of the Cosmogram, which connects fulfillment and sacrifice to shared destiny rather than exploitation, cultural and spiritual suppression. European colonizers systematically attacked African spiritual and cultural practices, many of which embodied the very cosmological understanding represented in the holographic Cosmogram. In the Americas, enslaved Africans maintained elements of their cosmological traditions despite severe repression, with symbols like the Congo Cosmogram appearing in cultural artifacts and religious practices. Christian missionary activities often participated in this suppression, while simultaneously appropriating and recontextualizing African spiritual concepts. This violated the how dimension of the Cosmogram, which recognizes multiple valid avenues of meaning-making and interpretation. The destruction of traditional African knowledge systems represented not just cultural loss, but the disruption of integrated worldviews that maintained ethical balance between material and spiritual realms, as depicted in the where dimension of the Cosmogram. Economic exploitation and resource extraction. Colonial economic systems treated Africa primarily as a source of raw materials and labor, establishing extractive relationships that continue in modified forms today. This approach fundamentally contradicted the principle of reciprocity embedded in the mathematical relationships of the Cosmogram. The colonial plantation system in the Americas represented a complete inversion of Ubuntu ethics, replacing communal self-realization with forced labor for others' benefit. This system violated the what dimension of the Cosmogram, which recognizes the interconnectedness of life, nature, and causality. Contemporary economic relationships between Western nations and Africa often perpetuate imbalanced exchanges, with resource extraction benefiting external parties more than local communities. This ongoing asymmetry contradicts the Cosmogram's emphasis on balance and equity, political domination and its legacies. Colonial governance structures imposed arbitrary borders that divided ethnic groups and forced disparate peoples together, disrupting traditional political systems that often embodied elements of Ubuntu philosophy. This violation of self-determination contradicted the Cosmogram's recognition of freedom within communal contexts. Post-colonial interventions by Western powers, from CIA-backed coups to structural adjustment programs, continued to undermine African sovereignty. These actions violated the principle of equality emphasized in the all dimension of the Cosmogram. Contemporary international relations often still reflect power imbalances established during colonialism, with African nations underrepresented in global governance institutions. This systemic inequality contradicts the Cosmogram's vision of balanced relationships, contemporary manifestations, and possibilities for reconciliation. The legacy of these historical violations continues in contemporary realities like mass incarceration, environmental racism, and global economic inequality. However, movements for restoration and reconciliation also draw upon principles aligned with the holographic Cosmogram's ethical framework. Reparations movements conceptualize justice not merely as individual compensation, but as restoration of broken relationships and systems, aligning with the Cosmogram's principle of cyclical justice. This approach recognizes that ethical debts created through centuries of exploitation require intentional rebalancing. Afrocentric educational approaches seek to restore knowledge systems disrupted by colonialism, reintegrating the holistic understanding depicted in the Cosmogram. These efforts recognize that decolonizing knowledge is essential to ethical restoration. Environmental justice movements increasingly incorporate indigenous and African perspectives on humanity's relationship with nature, reflecting the Cosmogram's integration of humans within broader natural and cosmic systems rather than separate from them. Conclusion: the holographic Cosmogram presents an ethical framework grounded in African philosophical traditions that emphasizes interconnectedness, balance, and holistic understanding. When Western Europe's behavior toward Africa and people of African descent since 1492 is examined through this lens, profound ethical contradictions emerge. The transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, scientific racism, and ongoing economic exploitation represent systematic violations of the ethical principles embedded in the Cosmogram. These violations were not incidental but fundamental to the establishment of global systems that continue to shape contemporary realities. True reconciliation would require not just acknowledgement of historical wrongs, but a fundamental reorientation toward the ethical principles embodied in the Cosmogram, recognizing that I am because we are, that humanity flourishes through balanced, reciprocal relationships, and that genuine ethical behavior must integrate all dimensions of existence. This reorientation would necessitate structural changes to political, economic, and knowledge systems that currently perpetuate imbalanced relationships originating in colonial violation. The holographic Cosmogram thus offers not just a framework for ethical critique, but a vision for transformation, a potential path toward relationships between peoples and nations that embody the mathematical symmetry, spiritual wholeness, and communal flourishing depicted in its integrated design. Perfectly detail the behavior of Africa and its cultural decedents towards Africa and people of African descent from 1492 up until the present day in light of this ethical comprehension across all areas of human activity. The holographic Cosmogram's ethical framework, rooted in Ubuntu philosophy and African cosmological principles, provides a profound lens to examine Africa's relationship with itself and its diaspora from 1492 to the present. This analysis reveals both enduring ethical alignments and systemic violations across 5 centuries of interaction. Pre-colonial foundations pre-1492. African societies like the Akan matrilineal kinship systems and Igbo complex family alliances embodied Ubuntu principles through communal governance, leadership based on lineage and elder wisdom, maintaining balance between individual collective needs, reciprocal trade networks, trans-Saharan exchange systems respecting mutual benefit rather than extraction. Spiritual integration, traditional belief systems harmonizing material and spiritual realms, as seen in Congo Cosmogram practices. These systems operationalize the cosmogram's all-dimension through symmetrical social structures and Y-dimension through purpose-driven community life. Colonial Disruption, 1492 to 1960s. The Portuguese initiated slave trade 1101, and subsequent European colonization systematically violated cosmogram principles. Kinship destruction. 12 million Africans forcibly removed severed Ubuntu's I am because we are connective tissue. Spiritual fragmentation. Christian missionary campaigns suppressed traditional cosmologies while appropriating symbols like the Congo cosmogram. Economic inversion. Plantation systems replaced reciprocal exchange with extractive monocultures, violating the what dimension's natural balance. Papal bulls, 1452 to 1455, and scientific racism institutionalized these violations, weaponizing the how dimension's interpretive frameworks to justify dehumanization. Diaspora Dynamics. The African diaspora developed complex relationships with the continent. Old diaspora, slave descendants, maintained Ubuntu through Bantu Congo cosmogram preservation in Haitian Veve symbols and Brazilian capoeira. Pan-African movements pursuing cyclical justice via reparations advocacy. New diaspora, post-1960s migrants, navigated dual identities by channeling remittances, $95 billion annually, as modern kinship obligations, mediating conflicts between anti-racism struggles and homeland politics. Post-Colonial Struggles 1960s to present. Post-independence efforts grappled with colonial legacies. Political challenges. OAU's maintenance of colonial borders 13 contradicted Ubuntu's fluid community boundaries. Economic neocolonialism. Structural adjustment programs, 1980s to 90s, perpetuated extractive relationships, violating cosmogram reciprocity. Cultural renaissance. Sankofa movements reclaiming pre-colonial knowledge systems. NAU's Agenda 2063 seeking Ubuntu-inspired continental integration. Contemporary alignments. Modern initiatives consciously apply cosmogram principles. Ecological justice. Niger Delta activists combining environmentalism with ancestral land stewardship practices. Technological reciprocity. Diaspora engineers developing solar microgrids using communal labor models. Medical ethics, Ebola, HIV responses integrating traditional healers with biomedical systems. The holographic cosmogram reveals an enduring ethical thread, from Igbo village democracies to Black Lives Matter. Global networks, persistently recentering Ubuntu's radical interconnectedness against 500 years of systemic violation. True alignment requires dismantling colonial epistemological frameworks while empowering Africa's intrinsic capacity for holistic self-realization. Given this comprehension, what accounts for the why of European behavior towards Africa and people of African descent? The motivations behind European behavior toward Africa and its people from the 15th century onward stemmed from an interconnected web of economic, ideological, and political drivers that fundamentally contradicted the ethical principles of interconnectedness and reciprocity outlined in the holographic cosmogram. These motivations can be organized into four primary categories. 1. Economic exploitation. Gold commerce. Europeans systematically prioritized resource extraction over ethical reciprocity. Resource extraction. The Portuguese initiated gold mining in West Africa, later expanding to human trafficking. By the 19th century, 80% of European imports from Africa were raw materials like palm oil, rubber, and minerals. Labor exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade commodified 12 million Africans, transforming Ubuntu's relational humanity into chattel. Post-abolition colonialism continued coerced labor through cash crop systems. Market control. European powers used dumping tactics to flood African markets with cheap manufactured goods, destroying local industries. 2. Ideological justification. God civilization. Colonial powers constructed a moral framework directly opposing the cosmogram's holistic ethics. Christian universalism, papal bulls, and the doctrine of discovery framed colonization as spiritual salvation, despite suppressing African cosmologies like the Congo di Kanga. Scientific racism, pseudo-scientific hierarchies positioned Europeans as evolutionarily superior, justifying civilizing missions that contradicted Ubuntu's radical equality. White man's burden. The myth of benevolent paternalism masked extractive agendas, with figures like Cecil Rhodes claiming colonization was philanthropy plus 5%. 3. Political competition gloried nationalism. The Cosmogram's balance was shattered by zero-sum imperial rivalry, scrambled dynamics. The 1884 Berlin Conference formalized Africa's partition, driven by post-Napoleonic nationalism and German unification's disruption of European power balances. Prestige economics. Colonies became status symbols, with France and Britain competing to control strategic ports and trade routes. Military advantage. Maxim guns and quinine prophylaxis enabled small European forces to overpower African polities, despite Ubuntu's emphasis on communal defense. 4. Epistemic violence. Colonialism attacked the Cosmogram's integrated knowledge systems. Cultural erasure. Missionaries demonized African spiritual practices while appropriating symbols like the Congo Cosmogram. Educational hegemony. Colonial schools taught European history as universal, severing ties to Ubuntu's cyclical temporality. Medical imperialism. Public health campaigns often prioritized labor productivity over wellness, violating the Cosmogram's mind-body-spirit integration. This complex of motivations created self-reinforcing systems of exploitation. Gold financed slave ships, slaves produced plantation wealth, and wealth funded imperial expansion. The Cosmogram's ethical framework reveals these drivers as mutually reinforcing violations of Ubuntu's core principle, that human dignity arises from interconnection rather than domination. If African self-definition is represented by the phrase, "I am because we are," how would you phrase European self-definition in light of these behaviors? The European self-definition emerging from these historical behaviors and philosophical contrasts could be articulated as, "I am through conquest and control." This formulation encapsulates three core aspects of European identity construction relative to Africa. 1. Epistemic domination. The phrase reflects Europe's self-positioning as civilization's arbiter, exemplified by papal bulls declaring non-European lands terra nullius, scientific racism creating hierarchies of human worth, missionary campaigns suppressing African cosmologies while appropriating symbols like the Congo Cosmogram. 2. Individualistic ontology. Contrasting Ubuntu's relational we, European thought elevates the autonomous self. French Revolutionary Declaration of the Rights of Man framing rights as individual entitlements. Protestant Reformation's emphasis on personal salvation over communal spirituality. Colonial land enclosures replacing collective stewardship with private property regimes. 3. Expansionist imperative. The conquest element acknowledges Europe's material and ideological expansion. 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas dividing non-European world between Iberian powers. Cecil Rhodes's vision of philanthropy plus 5% uniting profit and civilizing mission 24. Contemporary economic partnerships maintaining neo-colonial resource flows. This formulation aligns with key historical patterns. 87% of African borders drawn by European powers at 1884 Berlin Conference. 210 billion euros annual resource transfers from Africa to Europe through unequal trade. 0 African universities existing when Europe established Bologna or Oxford 26. The definition reveals an identity forged through negation, defining self against constructed otherness via racial pseudoscience positioning Africans as evolutionarily inferior. Christian universalism framing African spirituality as primitive. Development discourse portraying Africa as perpetually backward, where Ubuntu's we creates ethical obligations. Europe's conquest ethic produced extractive systems violating the cosmogram's principles of reciprocity and balance. This self-definition continues shaping relations through structural adjustment programs, intellectual property regimes, and climate policy asymmetries. What is the fundamental cause of this European self-definition from the standpoint of the cosmogram? The fundamental cause of Europe's self-definition as I am through conquest and control lies in its ontological separation from cosmic interconnectedness, violating the holographic cosmogram's core principle that existence derives meaning from relational balance. This rupture manifests across three dimensions of the cosmogram. 1. Fractured why purpose. European motivation became unmoored from Ubuntu's communal self-realization, instead prioritizing zero-sum accumulation. The God-gold-glory triad treated resources as finite commodities to monopolize rather than shared elements of cosmic order. Anthropocentric hierarchy, positioning humans, specifically Europeans, as dominators rather than stewards within nature's web. 31 and Pax Romana. 31 linear progression myths. Concepts like manifest destiny replace cyclical cosmic balance with endless expansion. 2. Corrupted how methodology. The cosmogram's integrated epistemology fractured into dualistic systems. Sacred-profane divide, crusader logic conquest rather than relational harmony, redefined spiritual purpose as territorial. Scientific objectification, reducing living ecosystems and human communities to exploitable resources. Epistemic colonialism, replacing Ubuntu's dialogical knowledge systems, hierarchical taxonomies that justified extraction 32 with 3. Imbalanced all structural principles. Europe's identity crystallized through systemic asymmetry, monopoly over meaning. The doctrine of discovery negated Africa's pre-existing cosmological order. 31 and terra nullius 32 concepts. Weaponized temporality, positioning European history as universal chronology, framing African time as primitive or ahistorical. 31 while extractive mathematics, enslavement, colonial economics, 12 million humans trafficked, 210 billion euros annual resource drain, inverted the cosmogram's sacred geometric balance. This ontological rupture originated in Europe's failure to recognize itself as part of Africa's cosmic whole, a disconnect embedded when Greco-Roman thought began framing civilization as inherently separate from African cosmological continuity, where the cosmogram's Dikenga symbol depicts existence as an eternal cycle of transformation. Europe's conquest ethos imposed linear hierarchies that severed the Kalunga line connecting material and spiritual realms. The result was a self-definition requiring perpetual domination to sustain its fractured ontology, a violation of Ubuntu's foundational truth that no being's existence can be secured through another's annihilation. Is this self-definition and its consequences captured in the symbolic myth of Yurugu? Yes, the self-definition of Europe as fundamentally incomplete, seeking power through conquest and control, and the consequences of this orientation are symbolically captured in the myth of Yurugu from Dogon cosmology, as interpreted by Marimba Ani and others. Yurugu myth, core symbolism. Incomplete being. In Dogon myth, Yurugu is a male being who, out of arrogance and impatience, separates himself from the process of gestation, rejecting the principle of cosmic complementarity, the union of twin souls, male and female, that ensures wholeness and harmony. Creation of disorder. Yurugu attempts to create independently, but all he produces is incomplete and disordered, reflecting his own lack of wholeness. He is eternally restless, always seeking the missing part of himself, but forever unable to attain it. Separation and control. The myth describes Yurugu as responsible for disorder in the universe, acting in denial of the natural order and promoting disharmony. He is marked by a cognitive and spiritual deficiency, perpetually in conflict and threatening to the well-being of others. Endless search for fulfillment. Yurugu's descendants are condemned to an eternal, unfulfillable quest for completeness, which can never be satisfied because the principle of wholeness complementarity was violated at their origin. Marimba Ani's interpretation, European cultural asili. Marimba Ani, in her seminal work Yurugu, uses this myth as a metaphor for the foundational character asili of European culture. Separation as core principle, European culture, according to Ani, is dominated by the concepts of separation and controlled dichotomies like man versus nature, European versus other, and thought versus emotion. These separations negate the existence or value of the other, making all else subservient to European interests. Domination as vital force, the driving energy utamaroho of European culture is domination, reflected in the relentless imposition of Western values, destruction of other cultures, and the universalizing of its own worldview as a means of control. Universalism as mask for control. European claims of universal truth or civilization are, in Ani's analysis, tools for domination and intimidation, not genuine expressions of interconnectedness or reciprocity. Perpetual incompleteness. Just as Yurugu is forever incomplete and destructive, European culture in this framework is propelled by a restless, insatiable drive for power and fulfillment that can never be achieved through conquest or separation. Consequences in light of the Cosmogram. From the standpoint of the holographic Cosmogram, violation of complementarity, the European self-definition rejects the cosmic principle of wholeness through relationality. Ubuntu I am because we are, instead pursuing identity through separation, conquest, and control. Creation of disorder, this orientation leads to systems and structures, colonialism, slavery, exploitation that generate disharmony and suffering, mirroring Yurugu's mythic legacy of disorder. Endless search, never fulfilled, the drive for completeness through domination is ultimately futile. True wholeness, as the Cosmogram teaches, can only be found in balance, reciprocity, and integration, not in the endless subjugation of others. Conclusion. The myth of Yurugu, as interpreted by Marimba Ani and others, symbolically encapsulates both the European self-definition, rooted in separation and conquest, and its consequence as perpetual incompleteness, disorder, and the inability to achieve true fulfillment. This stands in direct contrast to the African cosmological and ethical principle of interconnectedness and wholeness. What shift in perception needs to happen globally to transform from Yurugu identification and ethics to an Ubuntu mindset and ethics in resonance with the Cosmogram? To transition from a Yurugu-based worldview to an Ubuntu ethics aligned with the holographic Cosmogram, humanity must undergo 5 foundational perceptual shifts that reconfigure relationships between self, community, and cosmos. 1. From separation to radical interconnectedness. Cognitive shift, replace the Cartesian I think, therefore I am with Ubuntu's I am because we are, recognizing consciousness as created through relationships. Systems impact, redesign AL and governance systems using the Cosmogram's 6 dimensions, who, what, why, how, when, where, all to ensure decisions account for ecological, spiritual, and communal impacts. 2. From extraction to regenerative reciprocity. Economic shift, abandon GDP growth metrics for MOT-inspired balance indicators measuring unresourced replenishment rates, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and community health indices. Technological shift, develop AL aligned with Ubuntu's uncalculated bond of solidarity, UNESCO AI ethics through algorithmic accountability to marginalized voices, INI data sovereignty protocols respecting communal ownership. 3. From linear domination to cyclical justice. Temporal shift, adopt Sankofa's boomerang temporality learning from ancestral wisdom while innovating to heal colonial traumas. 421. Legal shift, implement Cosmogram-aligned jurisprudence. Restorative justice models mirroring Ubuntu's understanding and forgiveness and climate reparations grounded in cyclical debt reconciliation. 4. From fragmented identity to twin selfhood. Ontological shift. Replace individualism with the Dogon twinning imperative, recognizing humans as nature's custodians, Ubuntu, Motho, one with nature, technology as an extension of communal being rather than domination tool. Educational shift. Teach relational literacy through oral tradition revival. Intergenerational mentorship networks, in Capoeira, like embodied knowledge systems. 5. From scarcity fear to abundance trust. Psychological shift. Dismantle capitalism's scarcity programming through Ubuntu wealth ceremonies, redistributing 10 to 20% of assets communally. Trauma-informed healing of colonial woundedness. Ecological shift. Apply Congo Dikenga principles to resource management. Sacred grove conservation models. Seasonal agricultural rituals honoring Kalunga's spiritual material balance. Implementation pathways. Sector Yurugu practice Ubuntu transformation. Governance sovereignty bioregional councils. Using consensus in Daba health. Individualism. 4443. AI ethics mining community Kyo designed algorithms with ethical mirrors. This perceptual metamorphosis requires ritual unlearning of 5 centuries of colonial epistemology while recentering indigenous cosmologies. Only through such root-level reorientation can humanity actualize the Cosmogram's vision of symmetry between material progress and spiritual wholeness. How can one overcome all fears and reservations to such global and personal changes? To overcome fears and reservations about implementing the profound shifts from a Yurugu-based worldview to Ubuntu ethics, a multidimensional approach integrating personal, communal, and systemic strategies is essential. Drawing from Stoic philosophy, spiritual traditions, and modern psychological frameworks, here's a synthesis of actionable pathways. 1. Personal transformation, recalibrating inner systems. Stoic fear management, negative visualization, systematically confront worst-case scenarios, e.g., what if global Ubuntu ethics fail? To reduce anxiety's grip. Control focus, direct energy toward actionable steps, e.g., community-building rituals, while releasing attachment to uncontrollable outcomes. Spiritual grounding, Bhagavad Gita-inspired detachment. Frame ethical work as duty dharma rather than ego-driven achievement, reducing fear of failure. Meditative embodiment, daily practices reconnecting to the cosmogram's interconnectedness, e.g., visualizing the Dikenga cycle. 2. Communal healing, restoring relational trust, participatory ethics. Implement Tarvidas's collaborative model, where communities co-design ethical frameworks through dialogue in Daba, ensuring shared ownership. Example: climate justice groups using ethical mirrors to audit policies against Ubuntu principles. Radical healing rituals, Sankofa circles, structured spaces to process historical traumas, e.g. slavery colonialism, while reclaiming pre-colonial cosmologies. Intergenerational storytelling, elders mentor youth in Ubuntu practices, bridging epistemic divides. 3. Systemic restructuring, dismantling fear-based systems. Institutional courage, replace GDP with Ubuntu metrics, track communal health indices, e.g., intergenerational solidarity scores, to incentivize ethical governance. Fear setting for organizations, adapt Tim Ferriss's framework to audit institutional anxieties about power redistribution. Epistemic justice, decolonial education, integrate African cosmograms into STEM curricula to counter Yurugu's separation ethos. Participatory AI, develop algorithms embedding Ubuntu's uncalculated solidarity, ensuring technology reinforces interconnectedness. 4. Ethical scaffolding, frameworks for sustained action. Fear source, Ubuntu counter strategy tool, example, individual inadequacy, communal mentorship networks, capoeira, inspired skills circles, systemic inertia, cultural erasure, cyclical. Accountability packs, oral tradition digitization projects, climate reparations tied to Dikenga phases, 54 blockchain preserved ancestral stories, 52. 5. Resilience through reciprocity. Stoic amplified Ubuntu. Combine Marcus Aurelius' obstacle as the way with Ubuntu's Ubuntu and Ubuntu. A person is a person through others. To reframe fears as communal growth opportunities. Bioregional councils, localized decision, making using Congo Cosmogram principles, ensuring ecological and social balance. By interweaving these approaches, individuals and societies can transcend fear-based paradigms, aligning with the holographic cosmogram's vision of integrated reciprocal existence. The path requires not just courage but ritualized unlearning of 5 centuries of colonial epistemology, replaced by systems honoring the sacred symmetry between self, community, and cosmos. Finally, how would you reason with someone with the Yurugu mentality, if such a mentality convinces them that switching to the Ubuntu-inspired holographic mindset is suicide? To address the concern that adopting an Ubuntu-inspired holographic mindset constitutes suicide for someone entrenched in a Yurugu mentality, we must reframe the conversation through ethical reciprocity, existential reorientation, and pragmatic reconciliation. Here's a structured approach. 1. Acknowledge core fears. The Yurugu mindset's foundational anxieties, when loss of control, fear that interconnectedness undermines autonomy. An identity dissolution, belief that individuality cannot coexist with communal ethics. Existential irrelevance, concern that abandoning domination-based systems erases purpose. Cite psychological frameworks like Todd Pressman's core fears, abandonment, loss of identity, meaning, purpose, death, to demonstrate understanding of their resistance. 2. Reframe suicide as metamorphosis. Use the holographic cosmogram cyclical symbolism to redefine transformation. Dikenga's 4 moments: birth, life, death, rebirth, positioning death of Yurugu logic as necessary for regenerative growth. Stoic amplified Ubuntu, Marcus Aurelius' obstacle as the way merged with Ubuntu's Ubuntu and Ubuntu. I am because we are, to reframe fear as communal resilience. Example: just as a caterpillar's metamorphosis seems like annihilation but births a butterfly, releasing domination-centric logic allows your purpose to evolve, not vanish, within a web of mutual flourishing. 3. Demonstrate pragmatic survival benefits. Leverage Ubuntu's proven efficacy in addressing systemic crises that Yurugu frameworks exacerbate. Crisis climate Yurugu outcome competitive resource Ubuntu solution collapse hoarding communal stewardship models, e.g. Niger Delta's Sacred Grove Conservation. AL ethics exploitative data extraction participatory algorithms KIO, designed with marginalized communities, isolation-driven mental health epidemics, Sankofa healing circles for intergenerational trauma. 4. Gradual integration pathways. Prove sustainability through incremental adoption. And micro-communities start with small trust-building rituals, e.g., shared resource pools redistributing 5% of assets communally. Ethical mirrors. Use AL audits to show how Ubuntu-aligned decisions enhance long-term individual, collective outcomes. Dual consciousness training. Blend Yurugu strengths, e.g. innovation, with Ubuntu ethics, e.g. reciprocity, in pilot projects. 5. Existential reassurance. Anchor the transition in Stoic Ubuntu synergy. Control focus. Influence what you can. Communal networks amplify agency against systemic threats Yurugu cannot solo solve, e.g. pandemics, AL disruption. Purpose redefinition. Your legacy shifts from conquest to custodianship, etched not in dominated territories but in healed generations. 6. Counter-suicide metaphor. Invoke the Congo Cosmogram's Kalunga line, the spiritual material bridge, to argue Ubuntu doesn't erase your I, but situates it within the we, like a single thread gaining strength through the tapestry. Suicide implies annihilation. This is transcendence. By meeting Yurugu logic's fears with cosmological reasoning, pragmatic evidence, and Stoic Ubuntu hybrid resilience, the shift becomes not self-destruction but evolutionary necessity.